Support for this day in esoteric political history comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is a lot of things. Odoo is award-winning management software. Odoo is total control of your entire company in one place. Odoo is a suite of fully integrated applications for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. Basically, Odoo is what your business needs to succeed. So, if you're ready to get more done in less time, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, business management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 29th, 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed a 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act into law. Reagan offered remarks that included this phrase: "To so many of our people, our Americans of Mexican descent, our Black Americans, this measure is as important symbolically as it is practically. It says to every individual, your vote is equal, your vote is meaningful, your vote is your constitutional right." To which a lot of critics responded, yeah, you're actually right. This might be more symbolic than anything. Jesse Jackson remarked, "We are glad we celebrate the extension of the Voting Rights Act, but if it is extended and not enforced, it is merely an Indian treaty," referring to the many treaties that the U.S. put on paper and then broke with Native Americans. So let's talk about the extension of the Voting Rights Act, why it's happening under Ronald Reagan, what enforcement of that act actually looked like from Reagan, and we can also bring it up until today a little bit because one of the characters in this story, someone who was trying to constrain the Voting Rights Act in 1982, is current Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. He's in this story. Also in this story, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Can already feel the flames on the side of my face.
Oh, yeah?
Story, so just
John
FYI.
Fair enough. And, you know, we don't have to fan those flames all the way to the current voting rights rulings in the Supreme Court with John Roberts had a plan. I mean, this is a massive, sprawling story. I particularly am interested in the sort of Reagan of it all. And let's go to that moment specifically. I mean, what is the pressure on Reagan to re-sign, re-up, extend the VRA just a couple years into his first term?
So the VRA is coming up for renewal because it had always been a time-limited act. It first expires in 1970 again. So it comes up again for reauthorization in 1982.
I'm sorry to interrupt you right off the bat, but can I just tell you, in that, the first Voting Rights Act was just 5 years. Like, that blows my mind, too. They're like, we're going to do this massive world-changing thing. 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Wait, you don't think we can solve racism in 5 years?
Good enough.
I was stunned to see that first term. Yeah.
I had to ask myself again, why do we keep having to renew this? Like, isn't this indefinite? It's not indefinite?
It's super not. No. So this is going to come up during Reagan's term. And the thing is, Reagan didn't really support the Voting Rights Act. He saw it through a lens where he would talk about it as an unconstitutional infringement on the rights of states to determine their election laws. And also, he kind of thought that it was, oh, I see, the South is all bad and needs to be taken care of. Like, why are we going to be punishing in perpetuity these southern states that should not be under the thumb of the federal government? So that was kind of the idea coming in. And it's not just about the Voting Rights Act. Like, he was always already doing this with the Department of Justice, trying to kind of ease enforcement of things like voting rights, affirmative action. He puts in place the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds. We should do a whole show on him. But he was somebody who you put in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and is like, we don't really need to enforce these laws. So Reagan gets this bill on his desk after it comes through Congress, and he's like, well, maybe I don't have to sign it. So that's kind of like where he is. Where's the rest of the Congress? The rest of the Congress, even though there was a lot of debate around the reauthorization, I mean, it passes overwhelmingly. Yes. So he's facing some pretty big differences with Congress on this.
Although I'm always giving the side eye to like the 8 people that don't sign
no kidding.
on. I'm always like, who are you? What are your names? I mean, this is also important because what I don't think we realize is that in a lot of these southern states where the population is 25%, 35%, they have no representation, or they have maybe one person representing them at the entire state level. So when we think about sort of like the percentages and the numbers and how Black people are getting represented politically, it's completely skewed, and really to this day. But being able to sort of reinforce this act again is a way of trying to prevent or correct, I should say, those statistics.
Right.
And there's this other big development that we have to talk about when we talk about the 1982 reauthorization, because it has a special provision in it, what's known as Section 2, which prohibits discriminatory voting laws. Well, the Supreme Court, which had taken a more conservative turn in the 1970s, had decided in a case in 1980 that a law is only discriminatory if you can show that somebody was back in a dark room going, I'm a racist, I want to keep Black people from voting, as opposed to its effect. Right? If you had a law that just happened to discriminate against people of color, well, then that's not unlawful. And so the new Voting Rights Act in 1982, the reauthorization, set up a test that was like, we can tell when you're discriminating against people. And here's a little test to kind of overrule in some ways what the Supreme Court had done. And it's that idea that the effective discrimination is discrimination and unlawful under Section 2 that would become kind of the contested part of this reauthorization.
Well, and this is the origin story for John Roberts' vendetta against the VRA, which culminates all the way up until just a few years ago in the Supreme Court. But, we'll come back a little bit to Roberts. But I do want to paint this larger picture of how the Reagan administration and conservative America at that point thought about the Voting Rights Act and racial policy in general. And, I know we should do a full episode on William Bradford Reynolds, who's the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. But, he's quoted as saying in this, that government-imposed discrimination had created a, quote, kind of racial spoils system in America. And so this is, maybe I'm stating an obvious thing here, a strain of conservatism here, but this is a moment not in which we're saying, the playing field has been leveled, but moreover, no, the playing field is now tilted in favor of racial minorities. And so that is really... But nothing
could be further from the truth.
Well, Kellie, come on. But he's the Assistant Attorney General, Kellie.
And the Attorney General and also John Roberts at this juncture argue that they don't want discrimination to be too easy to prove. And I sort of had to sit with that because it's like, wait, what do you mean you don't want it to be too easy? So you want to raise the standard of what of hoops and hurdles that people have to jump through in order to prove that they're being discriminated against. It's just utterly ridiculous, especially when you look at the numbers.
Hey there. Before we start today's show, I wanted to give a shout out to another show in the Radiotopia family, Radio Diaries. For over 25 years, Radio Diaries has been creating sound-rich, personal stories on history and beyond. It's some of my favorite radio of all time. It's been truly inspiring to me over the years. And now Radio Diaries is back with a slate of brand new stories for this summer and fall. For instance, there's the new miniseries, Making Waves, which will explore the rise of talk radio in America with stories about 4 little-known controversial broadcasters who changed the airwaves. There's also stories about the U.S. Navy's mission to get humans to live in the ocean, a group that led to the rise of American conspiracy theories, and the story of a woman who was part of the greatest climate migration in American history when folks fled the Dust Bowl to find a better life in California. Here's a little clip from that story.
I know Mama thought when we got to California, her and her kids would be fine. Plenty of work for everybody, places to live, plenty of fruit and vegetables and all this stuff. But that wasn't true.
The New Yorker calls Radio Diaries a venerable and remarkable audio documentary project. I also happen to agree, even though I don't write for The New Yorker. So take it from me or them. Subscribe to Radio Diaries wherever you get your podcasts and see the full archive at radiodiaries.org.
this idea that that things like affirmative action and protection of Black civil rights as reverse discrimination was foundational to the politics of people, including Roberts, who, at the time, he's 27 years old, and he had been Reagan's point man as a special assistant to the Attorney General, had been his point man on trying to come up with the arguments to defeat Section 2 and then really zero in on it to do both a public relations campaign but also to create kind of the legal theory. And his argument was that Section 2 would establish a quota system. And it's that language, quota system, that becomes just poisonous in the 1980s and 1990s. So the protection of Black voting rights gets equated with special privileges and a quota system for Black voters and for Black elected officials. And he says it would be difficult to conceive of a more drastic alteration of local government affairs, and called on the administration to take an aggressive stance against it.
Yeah. I want to start to wrap up a little bit with something else I think helps us understand why Reagan takes this act, and then a little bit of the legacy. So, as we said, there is a big debate in Congress, and it ends up passing the House and the Senate both overwhelmingly. But there is a number of, there's a pretty big, robust debate within the Republican caucus about how to authorize this, what to do with Section 2 in particular. No surprise, Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond were trying to just squash this whole thing in general.
Definitely the team you want to be on.
Yeah. Bob Dole ends up playing a sort of compromise role here where he says, look, to his fellow Republicans, he says, we have to break out of this image of ourselves as an elite party, an insensitive party. And he says, quote, our job now is to demonstrate concern to Blacks and others who doubt our sincerity. Call this a cynical reading of that, but in that it feels much more about perception than reality. Yeah. And even in Reagan's remarks, I sort of highlighted it in the intro, he sort of goes out of his way to point out, let's think of this as a symbolic thing as much as anything. And so
you need this as a symbol because discrimination ended, but we'll give you this.
So I think that is largely how the Republican caucus squares it. And there is also, I think, and Roberts, I think, is part of a lot of this sort of legal framework, an understanding that, okay, well, we'll do this larger symbolic act of renewing the VRA. We'll include Section 2, which does have some teeth behind it, but the federal bureaucracy can sort of stall that, and it won't really have, which actually doesn't seem to be the case. It does slightly backfire in the sense that at the very least, in 1981, there were three successful cases brought relying on Section 2, and in 1988, there were 175. I mean, the number of cases on the back of this, the actual sort of enforcement that we were talking about, does seem to skyrocket, which I think then starts a sort of decades-long project of saying, how do we then take the teeth out of this thing that we accidentally kind of gave teeth to?
Yeah. That's the deep state at work, baby.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're like bureaucrats within the Civil Rights Division pursuing these cases that I think certainly Reynolds would not have preferred to. So you get those laws in place, you can do a few things until Roberts ascends to Chief Justice, and then less so.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, that brings it all the way to Shelby versus Holder in 2013, which ends at Section 5, and then there's some bunch of rulings on Section 2 as well. And, Section 2 is largely seen now as a protection against gerrymandering, and there's been a bunch of rulings that sort of stall that or take the teeth out of that, of the way those maps come together and so forth. And, I guess one final thought is, we should be clear. There were lots of people. I mentioned Jesse Jackson in the intro, but there were lots of people who saw the writing on the wall in this moment and did call out, hey, when you tell us this is symbolic, we believe you,
Right.
So it's interesting because we think about how Roberts replaces Windhorst in 2005. John Lewis, who nearly died, gets his skull cracked in for marching for voting rights in Selma, Alabama, testifies against Roberts' nomination and says this: had Judge Roberts' narrow reading of the Voting Rights Act prevailed, fewer people of color would be serving in Congress and at both the state and local level today. And I think that's a real consequence of what happens when the wrong people are in leadership. What is possible? Lewis is touching on all of that. And, he's not wrong. He also sees sort of the writing on the wall by his nomination and knows that the Voting Rights Act is in danger.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a long time ago, but people on both sides of this fight were around and are still around and remember, So yeah.
Yeah, if anything, Justice Roberts is consistent.
Yes, there you go. All right. I hope the flames didn't get too high around Niki's head as we did this episode. She's trying to find a little inner peace. That does bring us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.